He lost a custody battle, and days later, his mother-in-law was found buried in her backyard, and what he did to her before the murder will shock you to the bones. The man behind the pulpit had finally snapped, and what he did would scar a town forever. The search had stretched on for days. Flyers fluttered on telephone poles, volunteers moved door to door, and her reading circle friends left increasingly frantic voicemails that echoed into silence. Lena Whitmore had vanished. Then, in the quiet hours before dawn, on November 18th, 2018, police dogs caught a scent in the frost-hardened soil behind her home. Officers moved in quickly, cutting through the cold earth until the shovel struck something soft. A blanket. A body. A secret not meant for daylight. At first, no one could fathom why. Lena was adored, a retired educator, a cherished grandmother. But as investigators pulled back the curtain, they unearthed a bitter custody dispute, a man consumed by his need to dominate, and a crime so vicious it would forever scar the small town of Darnell, Iowa. The one responsible? Not a stranger, not a shadow on the edge of town. It was a preacher. A man once praised for his devotion to love, mercy, and forgiveness. And his motive? Revenge, twisted, deliberate, and merciless. How did a figure of faith become a vessel of horror? This is the story of Julian Everett Cross. Welcome to True Crime's Altar, where every sin is punished, every betrayal has a cost, and every soul must answer to the truth. Like, comment, and subscribe, because these are stories the guilty hoped would stay buried. Darnell, Iowa was the sort of town where keys stayed in ignitions, where folks nodded hello at every crosswalk, and where Sundays were reserved for scripture and roast beef. It was a place rooted in tradition, in family, in belief. But by the winter of 2018, that sense of safety would be irrevocably broken. At the heart of it was Reverend Julian Everett Cross. To outsiders, he was a man of faith, charismatic, articulate, deeply admired. His sermons spoke of patience, loyalty, and redemption, delivered with such fiery conviction that it felt like truth itself flowed from his lips. But behind closed doors, his marriage to Danae Cross was unraveling. Julian's rigid dominance clashed against Danae's slow but sure reclamation of her independence. He had long demanded more than respect. He required submission, not just in their home, but in their church. Everything had to follow his word. Over time, Danae grew exhausted. Exhausted from the cautious silences. Exhausted from being a set piece in his grand performance. Exhausted from pretending. By early 2018, she made a decision that would shift everything. She filed for divorce. Julian took it as a betrayal of divine order. To him, it was not just rejection, it was rebellion. He had stood in pulpits proclaiming marriage as sacred, unbreakable. Now his own was crumbling publicly. But the divorce itself wasn't what threatened to unravel him. The true war was over their children, 12-year-old Simone and 9-year-old Ezra. They were his legacy, his lineage, and he would not give them up quietly. The custody battle turned bitter fast. Julian weaponized his position in the church, casting Danae as unstable, claiming she sought to dismantle a godly home. But Danae didn't come unarmed. She brought receipts, texts, recordings, testimonies, evidence of years of control and manipulation, of spiritual abuse veiled as discipline. She wasn't fighting alone. Her mother, Lena Whitmore, a retired English teacher and lion-hearted woman, stood beside her. Lena offered financial support, legal insight, and unwavering presence. But Julian believed she was doing more than just supporting her daughter. Because Lena wasn't just Danae's mother, she was also dating a man named Judge Barrett Miles, the very judge overseeing the custody proceedings. Their relationship had started well before the trial, entirely separate from Julian. But once he discovered it, something inside him snapped. Paranoia took root like a weed. He convinced himself Lena was orchestrating everything, twisting the judge's hand behind closed doors. The courtroom was filled to capacity. Darnell wasn't used to drama, but when a well-known preacher was on the stand fighting for his children, even strangers came to watch. Julian sat stoic in his tailored navy suit, flanked by his counsel. Across from him, Danae appeared composed, though her exhaustion clung to her like smoke. This wasn't just a legal matter. It had become spiritual warfare, at least in Julian's mind. He had spent months planting seeds of doubt in his congregation, preaching that modern forces were attacking marriage, that weak-willed women were being used as instruments of chaos. He never named Danae directly, but everyone knew. He portrayed himself as the righteous man wronged. But in court, that narrative dissolved. Danae's team laid everything bare. Emails, voicemail rants, recordings where Julian used scripture like a club to belittle and control. And then there was Lena. Her testimony was ice and fire. She stared Julian down and declared him a fraud, a wolf in shepherd's clothing, a man obsessed with power, not faith. Julian didn't flinch, but inside, fury swelled. He had expected reverence. Instead, he was exposed. And when the judgment came, it was a blow to everything he clung to. Danae was awarded full custody. Julian would only receive supervised visitation. But what shattered him wasn't just the outcome, it was the man who delivered it. Judge Barrett Miles. The man Lena now held hands with on quiet Sunday evenings. Julian had seen them once, leaving a restaurant, laughing under the glow of a streetlight. It wasn't coincidence anymore. In his mind, it was conspiracy. And from that moment on, he couldn't stop thinking about it. He had lost everything: his marriage, his children, his image. But one thing still fueled him: a desire to make the person he blamed most pay. And here, at the edge of his broken pride, he traded righteousness for ruin. And in that bitter exchange, he became what he once warned others about. He told himself the verdict would be the end of it, that he'd accept it with grace, maybe appeal later. But Julian Everett Cross wasn't built for surrender. Not to a woman. Not to her mother. And certainly not to a man she now loved. In the weeks that followed, he still played the grieving father. He appeared at church, told quiet stories of perseverance, even held prayer circles. But behind closed doors, he was falling apart. He stopped returning calls from his elders. He skipped court-mandated counseling sessions. He isolated himself in his darkened home, nursing whiskey and bitterness in equal measure. He replayed the courtroom over and over in his mind. And every time he arrived at the same image: Lena. The root of it all. The orchestrator. The enemy. He began following her. At first, it was just occasional drives by her house. Then he began logging her habits: her grocery runs every Wednesday, her book club Fridays at 7, her visits to the judge's home on Sundays. And as he watched her smiling, living, laughing, while he grieved in silence, something in him hardened. One night, sitting in his car down the street from her house, a dark notion surfaced. Not just a thought, a plan. And in the stillness of that moment, he crossed the threshold of damnation. Not with a scream, but with a whisper that said, "She has to pay."
If you're enjoying this story, kindly do us a favor and subscribe to our channel. It is free and won't cost anything, but it means the world to us. We're just a small channel trying to grow. Thank you, and back to the video.
November 16th, 2018. Lena Whitmore was home alone, preparing the house for her Friday night book club. She brewed a fresh pot of coffee, laid out shortbread on a tray, and straightened the pillows on the living room couch. She had no idea that outside, beyond the porch light, Julian Everett Cross was watching. He had circled her block 3 times that day, each time noting the cars on the street, the glow from her windows, the rhythm of her movements. He knew there would be no guests until later. At 6:52 p.m., her porch light blinked on. She was home, alone. At 7:03, Julian stepped out of his car. The air was cold, the world silent. He walked up to the door and rang the bell. Lena hesitated. She hadn't seen him since the custody hearing, when she stood against him in court and shattered his illusion of authority. She cracked the door just wide enough to see his face. He looked hollow, bloodshot eyes, disheveled hair, not the composed preacher the town once revered. He told her he needed to talk. Just a conversation, he said. Closure. Despite the knot in her stomach, Lena opened the door. And the moment she did, he forced his way inside, locking it behind him. What started as words quickly unraveled. Julian shouted accusations, said she'd manipulated the system, seduced the judge, turned his own children against him. Lena stood her ground, told him it was his own cruelty that had lost him everything. And that was all it took. He snapped. The attack was savage. Lena fought. She clawed at his face, dug her nails into his skin, screamed into the silence. But no one heard. Julian pushed her to the floor, held her down. He struck her hard and harder still. His rage overwhelmed restraint. And in that room, where books lined the walls and warmth once lived, he became the very evil he claimed to preach against. By the time it was over, her body lay broken beneath the coffee table. Julian stood over her, panting, trembling. This wasn't how he'd imagined it. He wanted her to fear him, to hurt, not to die. But now she was still, silent, gone. He wiped the sweat from his face with a dish towel. His shirt was soaked with blood. Panic set in. He dragged her body to the back door. The grass behind the house was slick with frost. Under the dim light of the moon, he took a garden spade from the shed and began digging. The earth was stiff, the grave shallow. It took over an hour. By the time he finished, he was covered in dirt and shaking. He stared down at her one last time, then shoveled soil over the woman he once called family. He buried more than a body that night. He buried every last shred of the man he used to be. When it was done, he stepped back inside, locked the door, and disappeared into the dark. Lena Whitmore had vanished. But the search for her had only just begun. The next morning, Darnell, Iowa, woke to a strange silence. Lena's friends arrived at her house expecting book club at 7:30 p.m. the night before, but the house was dark. Her car sat in the driveway. No one answered the door. They knocked, called, waited. Lena never missed book club. She was the one who always reminded them. By midday Saturday, concern turned to fear. Her daughter Danae began calling anyone she could think of. By nightfall, she filed a missing person report. Within hours, the town mobilized. Lena wasn't just someone's mother. She was a beloved member of the community. A woman dating a sitting judge. Her disappearance wasn't just unsettling, it was seismic. The police followed standard procedure, but something felt off. Her purse was still in the house. The door had been locked from the inside. Her phone had gone silent after 7 p.m. the night before. No texts, no calls. Then came the break. A neighbor had a motion-activated security camera pointing toward the road. At exactly 7:03 p.m., it recorded a car pulling up in front of Lena's home, headlights off. A shadowy figure stepped out and walked toward the front door. The footage was grainy, but the car, a dark 2012 Ford Taurus, was unmistakable. Registered to Julian Everett Cross. With Lena still missing, the search expanded rapidly. Police, fire crews, volunteers, everyone came out. They searched fields, parking lots, riverbanks. By Sunday morning, officers returned to her home for a deeper sweep. That's when one of the K9 units stopped cold in her backyard. The dog wouldn't move from a small patch near the fence. A second dog was brought in. Same result. The officers exchanged knowing looks. They picked up their shovels and began to dig. The soil came up too easily. Then, fabric. A blanket. When they peeled it back, the missing became the murdered. Lena Whitmore had been buried in her own yard, not 10 feet from her kitchen window. Like a secret someone thought would stay hidden. The moment her body was found, the case shifted. No longer a disappearance. It was homicide. And with the earth now opened, so too was the truth, and it reeked of rot and rage. The brutality of her wounds left no doubt. The shallow grave screamed desperation. This hadn't been orchestrated by a seasoned criminal, but someone with motive and panic. As the evidence was gathered, all signs pointed to one man. Julian Everett Cross. It wasn't just the car on the footage. He had no alibi for that Friday night. When detectives questioned him, his answers were disjointed. He claimed to have been home all night, said he went to bed early. But phone data betrayed him. His device had pinged near Lena's house at 6:45 p.m. Surveillance caught his car at 7:12. By 9:30, his phone was back at his own address. 2 hours. Just enough time for her to be attacked, killed, and buried. And Julian had no explanation. What's buried in lies always rises in truth, and his silence now spoke louder than scripture. Detectives kept digging, this time into evidence. They found Julian's fingerprints on the back door handle of Lena's home. They found soil from her yard embedded in the treads of his dress shoes. And most damning of all, under Lena's fingernails, forensic analysts found skin cells. She had fought, scratched, clawed. And the DNA was a match. Julian Everett Cross. When he was confronted with this, his demeanor cracked. At first, he denied everything, claimed he hadn't seen Lena in weeks. But when they laid the evidence before him, the surveillance, the phone records, the DNA, he fell into silence. By the evening of November 19, 2018, Julian Everett Cross was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. News of his arrest spread fast. The man once hailed as a shepherd of souls was now being led from his home in handcuffs. His congregation was stunned. Some refused to believe it. Others felt betrayed to their core. Julian, the man who preached of righteousness and order, had been hiding darkness so deep it swallowed the very words he once used to uplift others. And the whispers around town grew louder, because with the arrest came more revelations. A pattern of manipulation, a legacy of control disguised as devotion. And so the veil fell. The man behind the pulpit was no prophet, only a predator draped in holy robes. His trial began on March 4th, 2019, in a courtroom packed with residents of Darnell, desperate for answers. The prosecution wasted no time. They laid out the timeline with surgical precision. Julian lost custody, obsessed over Lena's relationship with the judge, stalked her, then struck. Forensic experts tied it all together. His presence at the scene, the DNA, the car, the hole in his alibi. His rage, his motive. Danae Cross sat through it all. She had once built a life with this man, had once stood at an altar beside him. Now, she watched him fight for his own life. Their children, Simone and Ezra, were kept away, shielded from the proceedings. They were too young for this kind of truth. But still, the weight of their father's crime hovered like a shadow over their every breath. Julian's defense team pushed back. They argued there was no eyewitness, tried to question the forensic reliability, suggested the DNA under Lena's nails could have come from an earlier disagreement. But their arguments were grains of sand against a tidal wave. The evidence was overwhelming. And the truth, once buried, rose like thunder. It did not ask to be believed. It demanded it. Julian's crime wasn't impulsive. It was calculated, intentional. This wasn't a fall from grace. It was a descent. The jury remained composed, but the weight in the room was unbearable. What the people of Darnell had hoped to find in that courtroom was understanding. What they witnessed was the unraveling of a man who had placed himself above judgment, and who now sat at the mercy of it. On March 22nd, after just 4 hours of deliberation, the verdict came. Guilty. Julian Everett Cross sat motionless. The voice that once boomed through sanctuaries now spoke nothing at all. The judge sentenced him to life in prison, no possibility of parole. When the gavel fell, it echoed not just in the room, but in the bones of everyone present. The man who had claimed to lead others toward light had built his life on a lie. And now he was bound by truth, shackled to consequence. There were no gasps, no cries, only silence, the kind that follows a storm. In that silence, justice breathed, and the monster cloaked in scripture was no more. The trial was over. But the impact of Julian Everett Cross's crime didn't vanish with the verdict. In Darnell, people spoke in hushed tones, afraid of what had lived so quietly among them. His conviction may have brought legal closure, but for those who knew him, who had trusted him, the devastation lingered like smoke in a sanctuary. Danae Cross chose to remain in town. Not because it was easy, but because she wanted her children to have something that resembled normalcy. She refused to let Julian's actions shape Simone and Ezra's future. Her role in the community changed overnight. Once the preacher's wife, she was now a single mother rebuilding a home from ashes. Some people pitied her. Others looked to her with quiet respect. Simone, now in her teens, rarely spoke of the trial. She avoided the subject at school, carried her silence like armor. Ezra, still young, asked questions Danae couldn't always answer. She tried to shield them both, but the echoes of what their father had done followed them like shadows on the sidewalk. Judge Barrett Miles, the man who had become a silent target of Julian's unraveling, stepped down from the bench not long after the trial. Though he had ruled impartially, the personal connection to Lena, now known publicly, was something he could never shake. The courthouse could no longer separate his name from hers. The church where Julian once preached remained closed. The doors that had once opened to hymns and sermons now hung heavy with dust and silence. It stood as a reminder of trust betrayed, of a faith weaponized, of a man who mistook control for godliness. And there it stood, a monument not to salvation, but to the cost of spiritual arrogance. In time, new pastors would come to town. New families would take seats in new pews. But the story of Julian Everett Cross would not be forgotten. He had believed he was owed something: his family, his authority, his reputation. But when those things slipped from his grasp, he didn't seek truth. He sought destruction. And in trying to reclaim his world, he demolished every soul that once lived in it. Now he spends his days in a concrete cell, surrounded by silence and the weight of what he chose to become. Simone and Ezra are older now. They've grown into the story, each carrying pieces of it in different ways. Simone doesn't answer when people ask about her father. Ezra sometimes stares too long at photographs, as though searching for someone who never really existed. Danae still speaks to them of faith, but not the kind her husband preached. She speaks of grace that doesn't demand obedience, of love that doesn't control, of truth that doesn't hide behind pulpits. As for Lena Whitmore, her name lives on in the school she once taught at, the library she helped build, the stories people tell of her courage. But more than anything, she lives on in her daughter, her grandchildren, and in the justice her life demanded. Because in the end, her voice, though silenced, became the loudest cry for truth. Julian thought he had buried her. But what he buried rose again, not as a body, but as a legacy. A legacy that spoke louder than any sermon he ever gave. And the world now knows the truth of him, not through his words, but through the grave he tried to hide. Julian Everett Cross believed he could bury a body, and with it, his guilt. He believed power could cover his shame, that rage could erase consequence. But truth has a way of clawing to the surface. And no matter how deeply it's buried, it remembers the hands that tried to silence it. This case was not just about a murder. It was about control disguised as love, pride masquerading as righteousness, and a man who used faith not to heal, but to harm. It began with a bruised ego, escalated through obsession, and ended in an act of unspeakable violence. But make no mistake, there was a choice at every step. He could have walked away. He could have sought healing, accountability, and peace. Instead, he chose revenge. And in that choice, he proved that no title, no collar, no pulpit can shield a soul from the justice it earns. To anyone listening who finds themselves in the middle of a custody battle, an abusive relationship, or a painful loss, this story is not a roadmap. It's a warning. Control is not love. Punishment is not justice. And silence in the face of suffering only breeds more pain. If you're overwhelmed, speak. If you're afraid, reach out. If you feel yourself slipping into bitterness or rage, don't carry it alone. Go to a counselor. Go to a friend. Go to the proper authorities. Because the moment you believe you have no one left to answer to, is the moment you are most dangerous. This story is not told to entertain. It is told to reveal, so that the next Lena Whitmore might be heard before it is too late, and so that the next Julian Cross might recognize the edge of that dark path and choose not to walk it. Thank you for watching True Crimes Altar. If this story moved you, shocked you, or opened your eyes, let us know in the comments. We want to hear where you're watching from and what you think about this case. Would justice have looked different to you? What would you have done in Danae's place? Remember to like, subscribe, and share this video with someone who needs to see it. Because here at True Crimes Altar, every sin is punished, every betrayal has a cost, and every soul must answer to the truth.